Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us again in our series of videos entitled The Story of the Bible, where we've taken someone has come up with the 17 Bible time periods and studying a time period each week and trying to see the Bible as one continuous story and to see where every character, event, and story takes place within that story of the Bible. We find ourselves now in the New Testament. There's not many time periods of the 17, only 3 of them that find themselves in the New Testament. That's not surprising. The Old Testament is much larger than the New Testament. Plus, the New Testament just easily breaks itself up into 3 different categories. And tonight's video, we're in the middle of those, looking at the early church. And again, thanks for joining us. My name is Ken Chapman. I'm the evangelist at the South Bumby Church of Christ in Orlando, Florida. And our co-host is Jonathan Caldwell, who's an evangelist with the Moody Church of Christ in Moody, Alabama. How are things going, Jonathan?
Going well, enjoying the study, ready to get close to wrapping it up and looking forward to whatever is next in store.
Yeah, I've enjoyed it too, and I hope our viewers have. This video is intended for 2 different categories of people. Those who may be new to Bible study as kind of a foundational, basic entryway into understanding the story of the Bible. And for those who are seasoned Bible students, it's a good review to be able to better see each story and event and a character that you already know about, to see where they fit on that timeline in the story of the Bible. But as we said, we're looking at period number 16 tonight that's entitled Early Church. The first period of the New Testament was period 15, talked about the life of Christ. And now we're looking at period 16, the early church. And that is just basically a study of the book of Acts, isn't it, Jonathan? I mean, we could supply some things from the epistles, particularly the letters of Paul, that may give us some additional information about people and places. But for the most part, this period number 16 is just a study of the book of Acts. And it's kind of an introduction to that. We talk about the book of Acts and the role that it fulfills. This isn't original with me, and you may have heard this before, but the book of Acts kind of serves as a bridge, so to speak, between the Gospels and the epistles, the periods before and after this one in our 17 Bible time periods. You know, if you read the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and read about the life of Christ, particularly the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, and if you just skipped the book of Acts and went to the epistles, you'd have some questions. You'd read about these people known as elders and deacons and say, well, who are they? And you'd read things about the church. And although the Gospels, Jesus talked about his church, but how did it come into existence? And really, what is it? And what's its function? And how did people get into that? And so the book of Acts serves as that bridge between really the Gospels, the life of Christ, and the church. And that's what most of these epistles were letters that were written to first century churches. And it fills that gap and talks about really the next step in the fulfillment of, again, what we've called the story of the Bible. Now, if we talk about the story of the Bible, all the way back to that first of these 17 Bible time periods, we would say it's really the story of Christ. The story of the Bible, every event, every character has been leading us to Christ. But you might be saying, well, then why didn't we quit with the life of Christ? Why did we continue on? Because you can't really talk about Christ without talking about the church. In Ephesians 1, the Apostle Paul says, and he, speaking of the Father, put all things under the Son's feet, and gave him to be the head over all things to the church, which is his body, the fullness of him who fills all in all. And so, yes, the story of the Bible is the story of Jesus Christ, but it's also the story of the church. You cannot separate the two. The church is the fullness of him. Jesus came not just to fulfill prophecy, but he came to fulfill that prophecy for the purposes that God had outlined. And that is that he could have a people that he could call his own, and that is the church. Later in the book of Ephesians, in chapter 3 and verse 10, we see that the Apostle Paul tells us that the church is really the culmination of the plan of God. When he says in Ephesians 3, verse 10, to the intent that now the manifold wisdom of God might be made known by the church to the principalities and powers in the heavenly places. I like to think of it like this, that those principalities and powers were wondering and curious as to what God was doing and what God was saying. What did God mean when he made those promises to Abraham? What did God mean when he said this through that prophet or that spokesman? And now through Jesus Christ, through the church, those principalities and powers in the heavenly places were just going, oh, that's what he was doing. They saw all the pieces of that puzzle being put together and seeing the manifold wisdom of the plan of God in the entire story of the Bible. Jonathan?
This is an important concept because there's this maybe growing idea in our society today that we want Christ without the church. We want Jesus without religion or something along these lines. And such a concept is just so foreign to Scripture. And you see that in especially these two passages you've just showed us, that no, this was the plan all along. Unlike what premillennialism says, that the church was kind of plan B after plan A failed. No, that's not what's going on. This was God's intent from the beginning. You can't have the Christ without the church. He's the head of it. We're put into it. We make it up, and this is just simply the way it is. So in some ways, you kind of got to get over that idea of that distaste for organized religion and that kind of a thing, because, well, it's what the Bible talks about.
Yeah, you can't have the head without the body.
Right.
And, a lot of times we talk about the idea of Christ being the head of the church, and we emphasize, and probably correctly so, we emphasize the point of leadership, that he directs. It's the head who is in charge. And that's absolutely right. But I don't think we can miss the other point that's probably intended by that head body analogy. And that is there's a connection, an inseparable connection between the head and the body. And that's a good point, Jonathan. And so we said that the early church, this section of the Bible history, is really just the story of the book of Acts. And so, Jonathan, what I thought we would do, there's 28 chapters in the book of Acts, and we're just very quickly going to go through and summarize. I stole this chart from Brother Phil Roberts, one of my Bible professors at Florida College. This is still in my notebook when I took New Testament history under his tutelage. And so these are kind of the key events of the chapters of Acts. In chapter 1, we have the ascension of Jesus. Going back to the Father. Mark and some of the other gospel writers record that at the end of their gospels. Luke includes that to kind of, I think, in a way, tying the gospels to the book of Acts, that this last act of Jesus on earth is recorded there in chapter 1. And as the gospels ended with the loss of Judas, we're down to 11 apostles. Now we have the choosing of Matthias to take his place. And so the number is restored back to the 12 apostles who will go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. And that's exactly what happens as we follow an outline that started there in chapter 1, the day of Pentecost, the preaching of the gospel, the coming of the Holy Spirit, that power that would come upon those apostles. And they preached for the first time on that day of Pentecost and famously told them what they needed to do in order to be saved. And famously, 3,000 souls were added to the church that day in Acts chapter 2. And then beginning with chapter 3 throughout the book of Acts, we just have really the works of the apostles. And again, Jonathan, this isn't original with me, and I know you've heard this, and he probably even said this statement in a class on the book of Acts. I had an old professor that said one time that the Acts of the Apostles, it's not all the acts of all the apostles, And it's not some of the acts of all of the apostles. And it's not all the acts of some of the apostles. It's some of the acts of some of the apostles. And so as you're reading through this, don't get the picture that if you're reading a story about Peter and John, don't picture the other 10 apostles sitting at home watching TV doing nothing. Or if you're reading about Paul, don't think that the other 11 are doing nothing. Try to imagine that you're seeing 1/12 of the work that's being done. And while Paul is off at Ephesus doing this or in Corinth doing that, the other 11 are somewhere else doing the exact same thing. And just imagine how big the book of Acts would have to be if we had all the acts of all of the apostles.
Acts 1:1 says, in the first book, O Theophilus, I have dealt with all that Jesus began to do and teach. J.A. Thompson, in his little book on Acts, argues that the best title for the book of Acts is all that Jesus continued to do and teach. Except, now he's doing it through the apostles and the Spirit. I kind of liked that as a little bit of a better title than what we normally say, the Acts of the Apostles.
Yeah, that would be a good one. This is the continuation, as he had commissioned these men and told them that's exactly what they would do, is go into all the world. And of course, the book of Acts is a book of conflict, as the Gospels were. Conflict between the religious leaders of that day and Jesus. And now Jesus, as Jonathan just pointed out, through the persons of these 12 apostles, Peter and John are imprisoned by the Sadducees. Chapter 5, we have the infamous story of Ananias and Sapphira dying after lying to the Holy Spirit. One thing I notice here, Jonathan, is, chapter 4 ended with the story of Barnabas and others selling all of their goods, giving it to the church so that the poor could be helped. And then it's followed up by this bad story. It seems like Acts does that. Every good story is followed up by a negative story. Every negative story is followed up by a positive story. You see that contrast.
I can one up you there as well. I was thinking about making that comment. Not only is there the back and forth between the positive and the negative, there's also the back and forth between internal issues and external issues in the book of Acts. And it's neat. Now, you got to get a little bit more specific than we're going to get in this chart. But it's kind of a neat pattern, and kind of like what you and I were thinking about before we hit record. Sometimes we notice some things that are there, whether or not Luke meant for it to be like that. But it's still kind of fun to notice that, you have these good story balanced by a bad story, and then an internal issue balanced by an external issue.
And so the book of Acts, we often categorize it as a book of history. It's not just a book of history, because that's what's happening today. We'll have internal issues, external issues. The gospel will have that same effect today. It'll have a positive effect that the people will hear and respond to it positively. But unfortunately, today, there's still that negative response. And so some powerful lessons for us. There in chapter 5, the apostles are imprisoned again. Chapter 6, there's that internal issue, Jonathan, that you talked about. The widows, certain widows were being neglected. And so we have the choosing of the 7 to care for the needy. Many think this is the institution of deacons as servants for the church. And then we hit a kind of a low point in chapter 7 of Stephen's speech and the stoning. Stephen is famously remembered as the first Christian martyr, the first recorded one at least. And it seems to me that when the Jews stoned Stephen, which according to Roman law would have been an illegal action to take, but when the Rome didn't punish them for doing that, this opened the floodgates of persecution. They thought, okay, we can do what we want to Christians at least, and Rome is not going to lower the boom on us. And so it seems that from chapter 7, we see persecution before that, but it's isolated particularly to the apostles, and seems to be in a limited nature of imprisonments and beatings. But after the stoning of Stephen, then it's just that the old country expression, Katie bar the door, and it all just comes flowing out. Jonathan?
There's another pattern that we see here that Luke really enjoys introducing somebody briefly and then bringing them back into a bigger role. That actually starts in chapter 4 with Barnabas, and then we see him come flying back into the scene in chapter 11, I guess it is. And then you have it with Stephen as well. You remember Stephen, and you obviously know this. Stephen is one of the 7 that are chosen in chapter 6. And then we see him come in. And then there's also a man named Philip in chapter 6, who I guess you can probably go ahead and pull up the next line on your chart here. And we're going to see a lot of his work is really specified in chapter 8.
There's a minor character in the story of the stoning of Stephen, a young man by the name of Saul.
Right.
He would be a forgotten biblical name if that's all we knew about him is his introduction. But he is going to dominate the remainder of the book of Acts. Chapter 8, we have the scattering of the disciples because of that floodgate of persecution that followed the stoning of Stephen. Philip, that Jonathan just referenced, it goes preaching in Samaria. We have the conversion of the Ethiopian eunuch in chapter 8. In chapter 9, we have the conversion of Saul, maybe one of, if not the most seminal event in the book of Acts, because as we said, he is going to become a major character of the remainder of the book. And then Peter goes to Joppa. So if we were to break the book of Acts into 3 sections, not even sections, but 3 sections, the first section, Peter would be the dominant character. And in the middle section, we've kind of got a collection of characters. We've got Barnabas and Philip and some others. And then obviously after that, Saul or Paul is going to become the major character.
Yeah, to piggyback on that, Ken, you could kind of divide those 3 sections by location as well. The first section could kind of be seen as Jerusalem. The second section could kind of be seen as Antioch. And then the third section could kind of be seen as the Mediterranean basin, that whole area as we get those travels of Paul.
Which follows the outline introduced in chapter 1, what Jesus told them to do. Go in those kind of concentric circles in the preaching of the gospel. Absolutely. The first Gentile convert comes in chapter 10. Up until this time, the gospel has been preached and warmly received by many, but exclusively in the Jewish community. But beginning in chapter 10, of all people, it's going to be Peter, the first one who preached to the Jews, to be the first one who preached to the Gentiles. And from chapter 10 on, we have a change that the gospel is going to be preached unto all the world, as Jesus and even as the Old Testament had prophesied. The church is established in Antioch. Famine relief is sent to Judea. That little thread, minor thread, we might say, is going to pervade really the rest of the book of Acts and even some of the epistles of the Apostle Paul. Peter and James are imprisoned again, and James is even put to death, and the subsequent death as a result of that of Herod Agrippa I. And so we have the second of our apostles to die. Of course, the first one being Judas by his own hand, and now James by the hand of Herod. And then chapter 13, the first journey begins, and remember, of course, this is one of Paul's, his first, what we often call a missionary journey. And Jonathan, a little quiz for you here to put you on the spot. When did Paul become an apostle?
That's an interesting question. I was actually wondering if I should say something about the fact that, James is not replaced as an apostle like Judas was, but some argue that he is by Paul's apostleship. But I think Paul is pretty clear in Galatians and other places that his apostleship was of a different character than the 12. He had a little bit of a different role, but I guess he was made an apostle as soon as Jesus or the Spirit set apart him and Barnabas for that first trip there from Antioch.
Yeah, and it obviously Paul's appointment as an apostle isn't as well defined as that of Matthias. And so we don't make too big of a point of it, but you could make that argument that now we're back up to 12 with the appointment of Paul as an apostle. And so Paul and Barnabas, and what's interesting, Jonathan, is I know you've made this observation that when we start out here with these two characters, it's Barnabas and Saul. Barnabas is listed first, and then somewhere around chapter 13, it's reversed, and now it's Paul first and then Barnabas. And I think that speaks to the character of Barnabas. We don't see Barnabas pouting about that and getting upset that he's now, he started out being kind of in the forefront and Saul being introduced by him and those things, but now he takes a second seat to Paul in his work. And really the rest of the book of Acts is going to be about these journeys of Paul. We have that conference in Jerusalem over the question of the Judaizing teachers and circumcision, whether it was required of the Gentiles or not. And then we have the beginning of the second journey. In chapter 16, where Paul sees the vision of the man of Macedonia asking to come and help him. We have the story of Lydia and of the Philippian jailer, those conversions in Philippi. We have in chapter 17, Paul's speech in Athens, and we see such a contrast. It's the same gospel, but compare the sermon in Acts 2 to the Jews to the sermon in Acts 17 to the Gentile audience. Very different sermons. Again, the same gospel was going to save both groups of people, but appealing to the prophets, appealing to David, to Joel, those Old Testament characters wouldn't have meant anything to these people, these idol worshipers in Athens. And so a different approach had to be made. Chapter 18, we have the famous establishment of the church at Corinth. Paul finishes his second journey and starts his third journey. Now, we didn't make the point, we're going through this so quickly, Jonathan, that Barnabas accompanied him on that first journey, but they had a little bit of a falling out over John Mark, and now Barnabas and John Mark go off on their own missionary journey, and Paul takes Silas with him. And of course, as we're introduced to other characters, Timothy is there. If you pay attention to the pronouns, Luke is with him off and on in these journeys. But we're introduced to so many interesting characters, Aquila and Priscilla and Apollos, and then Paul running into these disciples of John the Baptist who had not been yet baptized. They've been baptized into John's baptism, but not into the baptism for the remission of sins that was initiated on the day of Pentecost. And so many interesting characters and stories here, Jonathan.
It's kind of funny that we are so clear in our distinction of these journeys. I wonder if Paul actually felt that way about it. One thing to keep in mind is that these journeys are not clearly divided along chapter lines. And if you blink in chapter 18, you'll miss that he leaves Palestine. And he's headed back out. He just swings through, maybe drops off some money or something, and he's headed back out. And so in his mind, I think it's probably less of this is my second, third, fourth, whatever journey. That's just kind of a way that, kind of like the chapter breaks in scripture that just help us keep track of some of this that's going on.
Now, Jonathan, that he had 3 photo albums.
Right.
The titles on the spine that said pictures from my first journey, pictures from the second journey.
That's right. His Facebook account was clearly, delineating these, checking in at Macedonia and that kind of a thing.
And I'm confident that Leon Malden has a copy of those photo albums of Paul's journeys and the photos that would have been taken along the road there. Chapter 20, remember chapter 20 because Paul stops in Troas and meets with the saints there, partakes of the Lord's Supper on that first day of the week, and then that very emotional farewell speech to the elders at Ephesus in chapter 20. And then, of course, the ending of that third journey in such a foreboding way. When he arrives at Jerusalem, he's mobbed at the temple. He makes his appeal to the crowd and retells. And so 3 times in the book of Acts, we're going to read about the conversion of Paul or Saul, Luke's historical account in chapter 9, Paul's retelling it to the mob here in chapter 22. And then we find that really the rest of the story is playing out his arrest and his fourth journey, if you will, and that's as a prisoner to Rome. And so Paul goes through this series of various trials, a trial before Felix, who was the governor at that time, and then his hearing before Festus, who succeeded Felix as governor, and then finally he makes his appeal to Caesar, and then he has a hearing before King Agrippa II, and then makes that voyage to Rome, including a shipwreck along the way. It's really interesting. Not a whole lot of doctrinal material in these last few chapters, but just really interesting to read about this journey. In fact, we hear more about the journey itself in this trip than we do in any of the others. We just have to really guess as to how Paul got somewhere. Sometimes it mentions a ship and all that, but we don't really talk about his mode of travel and the difficulties of the travel. We hear about the difficulties he had with his own brethren and with Jewish opposition. But it's interesting to see kind of the details of travel in ancient times.
It's kind of interesting. It's almost like Luke had too much scroll left at the end, and he's been waiting the whole time, because Luke, if you look at it, Luke is obviously a traveler. That's when he's with Paul, is when Paul is traveling. You change from the they and them to the we and us sections, and so he likes traveling. And boy, there's a bunch of scroll left, and he gets excited, and he's right. And it's interesting to study that section, because historians of shipping and that kind of a thing say that he gets everything exactly right, which is a really cool kind of hat tip to his work, but then also obviously inspiration.
Yeah, the authenticity of that story. And it's compelling to us because this is something that's foreign to us, this type of ancient travel. And so it's really interesting. And of course, by this time, when we get to these late chapters, we're so interested and so invested in the life of Paul and what's happening to him. And that's so important. And finally, the book of Acts ends rather abruptly, doesn't it, Jonathan? He arrives in Rome, and it's almost like one of those cliffhanger movies or television series where you just kind of ends and you're waiting for the next season to come along and tell us what happens. And maybe that's a segue to our next period, because we have to find out and fill in some of the gaps in the story of Paul in looking at the letters to the Christians. And that will be our next study in period number 17, and the final study in this series of videos that we've entitled The Story of the Bible. And we hope that you'll conclude our study with us next Monday night at 6:30. We look forward to seeing you then.